Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Mittman, and I am the moderator for Concurrent Session E1 with the title RWE and HTA, Past, Present, and Future. I'm just going to share my slides. One moment. And I'll put it into slideshow. And I believe I have to go display settings. One moment, folks. Thank you. Okay, so we're up and running. I just wanted to introduce, we have a number of presenters today. Amy Sood from our Scientific Advice Program at CADIF, Mandy Allard from our Pharmaceutical Reviews team at CADIF, Peter Deirdre for our Program and Policy Development team, Amanda Manor-Herrera, Program Development, Lori Lambert, our RWE lead, and I'm Nicole Mittman, and I will be the moderator for today. We have an outline of, just to give you a little bit of our past, present, and future, and some time for questions at the end. So please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom meeting, and we will see those questions in the chat function. Thanks so much. And why don't we get, before we get started, let's just from a disclosure point of view, we have speakers from CADIF who have no actual or potential conflict of interest. But in general, CADIF is funded primarily through contributions from the Canadian federal and provincial and territorial ministries of health. And we also receive funding from pharmaceutical companies for 3 programs through the reimbursement reviews and through our scientific advice program. So why don't I turn it over to Lori Lambert to talk a little bit about the ghosts of RWE.
So I've been at CADIF for 1 year now, and before that, but I have been working with real world evidence and meeting Nicole. We both agreed, as many others, we've been talking about real world evidence with lots of different names for at least the last 20 years and really much longer, and don't want to go through all these. We don't want to talk about the past very much today, but just we recognize, right, that there has been a lot of issues and differing opinions about real world evidence, especially the value of real world evidence in relation to randomized clinical trials. So just putting up a few examples there. Next slide. And just to say that I think we all know in Canada and elsewhere that we tend to work in silos, and that makes generating and using and talking about real world evidence very difficult. But that was the past. And now, more recently, where are we now? I can do this next slide if you want, Nicole, of just, one important thing is we now have collaboratively an international definition of what is health technology assessment. And I just thought it was important to put this up to show, how real world evidence fits, because it is very broad and there's a lot of different domains to ascertain the value of new health technologies. And that's why real world evidence can play a significant role. Next slide. And before I arrived, CADIF had already published with Health Canada an article in healthcare policy talking about an action plan for across the drug life cycle to integrate real world evidence. And so here we are today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicole and Lori. My name is Amy Sood, manager of CADIF's Scientific Advice Program, and I'm happy to share in the next few slides what we are currently doing with respect to real-world evidence very early in the life cycle of a drug, as well as highlight some potential opportunities. Next slide, please. First, I'll provide a bit of a background on the CADIF Scientific Advice Program for those of you who are hearing about it for the first time. Since January 2015, this program has been providing an opportunity for pharmaceutical companies to engage early with CADIF to inform evidence generation. As you can see with the red arrow, CADIS scientific advice is offered prior to the initiation of pivotal trials, at a time when adjustments can still be made to trial protocols based on the feedback received. This is many years before the drug goes to regulatory and HTA review. The goal of the program is really to inform evidence generation from a Canadian health technology assessment perspective, so that the evidence generated is meaningful and meets the needs of a future CADIS reimbursement review. And ultimately, we hope that this provides patients timely access to new drugs through the public drug plans. Next slide, please. We currently have 3 standard offerings, CADIS-only scientific advice, as well as parallel scientific advice with Health Canada and CADIS, with ENES currently participating in an observatory role, and parallel scientific advice with CADIS and NICE, our HTA colleagues in England. The parallel procedure includes a joint scientific advice meeting with CADIS and either Health Canada or NICE, as well as separate advice reports from each agency. We started parallel scientific advice now and requests for both offerings. Next slide, please. You'll get a sense from this slide the types of questions posed regarding the clinical and economic evaluation plans. We are seeing more and more interest at this early stage regarding feedback on real-world evidence generation plans. Among 28 advice procedures, 50% of these projects included questions related to real-world evidence, as you can see there. Some of the questions were broad and others were more specific, often related to the use of real-world data to inform indirect comparisons or to further support the interpretation of surrogate outcomes. We are continuing to accept questions related to real-world evidence as part of CADIS scientific advice, and we encourage applicants to consider integrating real-world evidence planning into the briefing book submission for early CADIS scientific advice. Next slide, please. In addition to the existing opportunity to seek advice on real-world evidence prior to initiation of pivotal trials, could there be a potential opportunity to explore how the CADIS scientific advice program could support the integration of multi-stakeholder dialogues to inform real-world evidence generation at additional time points in the life cycle of the drug? And you'll hear more about this from Lori in the last part of this session. Next slide, please. Please feel free to reach out to me via our scientific advice email, and if you have any questions about the program, I'd be happy to answer them. And with that, I will pass it over to Mandy. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to Nicole and Lori for setting up this panel. We can go on to the first slide, please. So I'm Mandy Allard. I'm the Director of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CADIS, and I've been in this position for only about 6 months or so, so I haven't had the opportunity to meet a lot of you yet. However, there is one thing that I do want you to know about me, and it's that I generally try to stray away from gossip and don't like to spread rumors unless they're really juicy. And I just couldn't help it but get involved in this one because I've heard that RWE isn't accepted or even used in CADIS reimbursement reviews. So I'm here to set the record straight and to describe to you when and how RWE could be incorporated into our CADIS reimbursement reviews. Next slide, please. So as everybody or my fellow panelists have already mentioned, the topic of RWE has been around for a while now. And what may not be immediately obvious to everybody is that CADIS has been working steadily to evolve our process to involve and incorporate RWE when it is appropriate. So one of the key things that I'd like to point out to you is that in late 2017, CADIS launched an expanded resubmission process that removed the requirement for sponsors to submit brand new RCTs in order to be eligible for a resubmission. So since implementing this change, we've seen resubmission requests that have included a wide range of evidence, and some even that have been solely based on RWE. Not too long after that, in early 2018, CADIT revised the approach and our own internal templates for our initial submissions that placed a greater emphasis on new and emerging forms of evidence generation. Of course, this would include RWE as well. Internally, we've adopted this change by providing additional guidance and training for our reviewers and for our expert committee members to facilitate seamless integration of RWE into the review and the recommendation phase. And for those of you that have a long history and file submissions with CADIT often, you may have seen that around this time, we added a section to our clinical review reports to incorporate other evidence that can support and fill these evidence gaps, giving it more of an emphasis in our review. Moving along to 2019, CADIT formally launched a reassessment framework. This was an important process change that provided a mechanism for industry to provide new data, including RWE, to support revised reimbursement criteria or conditions. And since implementing this, we've been seeing a gradual increase of interest from the sponsors in this, taking advantage of this opportunity. And now that brings us up to 2021, where we are today. Not too long ago, we expanded our reconsideration process to allow for the opportunity of new data to be submitted during this phase. This was just implemented in September and was announced in our pharmaceutical review update published on our website on September 16th. Now, of course, there are certain conditions where we will accept new information during this phase. And you can consult our website to go into that further, or I can go into some of those conditions a little later on if there's time. And of course, it's 2021, it's not the end of the road. So we do have some ongoing initiatives. Specifically, we're looking at establishing processes for coverage with evidence development. This isn't ready yet, it's an ongoing conversation, and I'll touch more on that a little bit later. All right, next slide, please. So you're probably wondering, I've shown you when RWE, or how we're working towards implementing RWE. So when is it actually included, or when could it be included in our reimbursement reviews? So there's really three scenarios where we would incorporate this information. The first is in an initial submission to CADIT. So this could be, in a standard submission, a cell and gene therapy, or as part of our tailored review process. The second is during these time-limited recommendations. And again, this is what I alluded to in the previous slide. This is something that's still under development, so not implemented yet. But we're expecting that RWE will play a large role in this. And then, of course, the third scenario would be during our resubmissions and our reassessments. So in the next couple of minutes, I'll take you through each of these scenarios. Next slide, please. Right, so contrary to popular belief, CADIT does in fact review RWE routinely as part of the CADIT reimbursement review process. And this is occurring for both our oncology and our non-oncology reviews. Essentially, CADIT will review all of the evidence submitted by the sponsor and will include any RWE as appropriate. So generally, real-world evidence isn't included as part of the CADIT systematic review, since it rarely meets the criteria established by the CADIT review protocol. And specifically, not many RWE studies would be RCTs, which is a common type of evidence that we limit our systematic reviews to. However, RWE is generally included as supportive evidence when it does address the important gaps that remain from the clinical trials included in the systematic review. So this probably leads you to another question. Well, how are these gaps identified? So the first, one way is by the CADIT critical appraisal team. And this is done throughout the review and conducted by our CADIT health economics and our clinical reviewers. It's also, we also identify gaps in the evidence in consultation with clinical specialists in Canada. As you may know, all of our drug review teams include at least one clinical specialist with experience in treating the condition for the drug under the review. So these experts are consulted at different stages throughout the review, and they are actually involved in developing our systematic review protocol. And they also help to interpret the data by providing a good clinical context of what's actually happening in Canada in clinical practice. Next slide, please. So the second scenario where I mentioned that we will be using RWE is for these, what we're calling time-limited recommendations. And these are really recommendations that are conditional upon evidence generation and reassessment. And as I've mentioned, this needs to be very clear. These are not currently issued by CADTH. However, we are involved in discussions on how to operationalize and implement these recommendations with our public drug programs and with PCPA. And of course, we need to consider the stakeholder perspectives when we are looking to implement these types of recommendations. And rest assured, all the stakeholders, including industry, will be notified of any of the developments as this initiative continues, and once we start getting into the requirements as well. Next slide, please. And finally, the third situation where RWE may feature in the CRR process is in the reassessments and the resubmissions. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, a reassessment is conducted when new evidence is available for a drug that has been previously reviewed by CADTH for an indication of interest and for which a final recommendation has already been issued. Resubmissions are typically limited to drugs that were not recommended for reimbursement by CADTH's expert committee and are not currently reimbursed by the drug programs for the indication of interest. So this differs from a reassessment, where a reassessment is conducted to address questions related to the comparable clinical benefit and or cost effectiveness of a drug that is currently reimbursed by the drug programs. Drugs that are it's specifically for drugs that are reimbursed, I guess, where there's uncertainty regarding the safety, the clinical effectiveness, and or the cost effectiveness. And sponsors seeking revisions to existing reimbursement criteria can take advantage of this process. So for both types of these submissions, RWE could either be part of the submission, in support of other new evidence that the sponsor is putting forth, or it may be the sole basis for a resubmission or a reassessment. Regardless, the sponsor should always include an explanation as to why the RWE is appropriate to address the evidence gaps, the limitations, uncertainty, and so on, that has been identified in the initial review conducted by the committee and by the CADTH review team. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to shift the topic a little bit and sort of talk about, from a CADTH perspective, and specifically from a pharmaceutical review perspective, when is RWE most useful for us? So general guidance from CADTH would be when the evaluation of clinical endpoints requires longer-term follow-up, which may not be available at the time of submission. When there's uncertainty associated with the duration of the treatment effect. When RCTs are impractical because of a small number of patients, or when randomized studies may lack the relevant comparators. RWE may also be useful when there's uncertainty regarding the dosages that are actually used in clinical practice. And finally, it's used as supportive evidence when RCTs have limited external validity, and additional non-randomized studies could provide meaningful insight into the effectiveness of the treatment in the target population. And this one is probably specifically most useful for rare disease treatments. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to provide some advice for mitigating some of the common challenges that the CADIT pharmaceutical review team has encountered so far with RWE. So our first piece of advice is to ensure that the methods and the results of the RWE that you're submitting are complete and accurately reported. We strongly encourage you to follow best practices for this types of studies. For example, the STROBE guidelines for observational studies. What we've seen in some of our submissions is a lack of standardized reporting, which ultimately leads to slow down our review process. And it consumes a lot of resources as our own reviewers, have to sift through the data with a fine-tooth comb and pull out, what we think is most appropriate. My second piece of advice is to be prepared for questions from CADIT. For those of you familiar or who have gone through our CRR process, you've probably had a few additional information requests. So if the real world evidence is based on third-party data, this could result in delays if you don't have access to all of the data. And this is probably common with studies based on academic registries. And thirdly, we encourage you to submit RWE with a robust study design and to ensure that the research question is clearly defined and to provide a clear justification of why a non-randomized design is appropriate. And some of the things we've seen is, when we've received multiple studies with the same patient population counted within the studies. So these are the types of things that we generally encourage you to avoid. Next slide, please. So I'll just wrap up with a couple answers to some of the most common questions that we've seen so far. The question is, how will CADIT consider the availability of registries in the recommendation process? And our answer is that CADIT recommendations are based on the evidence package assembled by the sponsor. Promises to generate evidence are not sufficient to address the substantial limitations. We actually need to see the evidence at the time of the submission. The second question is, how can sponsors effectively incorporate RWE in their application packages? Well, I hope that some of the hints on the previous slide and some of what I've talked about today has already helped answer that question. But to summarize, we encourage you to make it clear what the gaps are that the RWE is intended to address. And again, to ensure that there's complete and accurate reporting of the methods and the results. So I'd like to thank everybody for your attention, and I'll pass the mic.
Thanks, Mandy, and thanks, Lori and Nicole, for the opportunity today to spotlight some CADIT projects that are incorporating real-world evidence in HTA. Next slide, please. So my name is Amanda Manoharan, and I'm a Program Development Officer at CADIT. I'd like to walk you through a therapeutic review that's looking at the optimal treatment sequences in multiple myeloma, starting with transplant ineligible patients, and how CADIT is looking to incorporate real-world evidence in this therapeutic review. I'll then turn it over to Peter, who will speak about the psoriasis project. Next slide, please. So as illustrated in this table, in the newly diagnosed transplant ineligible and the relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patient populations respectively, the treatment landscape continues to evolve in the multiple myeloma therapeutic space. Of note, the novel agents that are becoming available in the market are very high in cost, and these expensive drugs are either added to current standard of therapy or they replace existing standard of therapy. CAIHI has also reported multiple myeloma among one of the drug classes with high drug program spending. So in summary, it's evident that drug programs also have reported a high amount of resource use at cancer centers associated with transfusion drugs, as well as you can see some of these drugs are generic, and more recently we've seen some generic lenalidomide become available. All these factors contribute to what makes multiple myeloma a complex therapeutic space. So in response, CADIT has initiated a therapeutic review. Next slide, please. So the underlying policy issue that this therapeutic review aims to look at is what are the optimal treatment sequences, starting with transplant ineligible patients that should be reimbursed to maximize clinical and cost effectiveness while considering patient characteristics, experiences, and perspectives. And in order to approach this policy issue, CADIF is collaborating with an international group of multiple myeloma experts that are based in the Netherlands from the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management. And the Netherlands team has developed 2 network meta-analyses, one in the newly diagnosed transplant ineligible patient population and one in the relapse refractory patient population. And these network meta-analyses will be updated in order to obtain relative comparative efficacy estimates on clinically meaningful outcomes such as PFS. And in parallel, the Netherlands team has also developed an economic model, which also includes Dutch registry data. Instead, CADIF plans to incorporate real-world data from a Canadian database holder. Next slide, please. This is a schematic of the multiple myeloma disease model. The economic model is a patient simulation model. So it simulates individual patients based on baseline characteristics, and for each patient, costs and effects are assessed to a maximum of 3 lines of treatment. Ultimately, the real-world data that is being used from the Canadian database set will calculate the cost effectiveness of different treatment sequences to identify whether the costs and effects would have been better for patients if they received a different treatment sequence. So CADIF is being proactive in developing a living economic model so that as novel agents become available in the multiple myeloma therapeutic space, these can be incorporated in the economic model to inform drug programs looking to manage their formularies and also search for optimal treatment sequences. We do recognize that while we are using publicly available list prices in the economic model, this presents uncertainty around the true cost effectiveness of treatment sequences. However, because the economic model will have some flexibility, this can also be shared with our payers in order to input the costs of the specific drugs within their respective jurisdictions. Next slide, please. There is tremendous value in using real-world evidence to fill in gaps in RCTs in oncology and possibly other disease areas also. In this therapeutic review on multiple myeloma, which is a complex treatment space, having access to Canadian real-world evidence allows us to gain insights into possible overall survival benefits, which is an important outcome for decision-making in HTA, as well as the opportunity to assess treatment sequences, in this case, multiple lines of treatment, and also gain a better understanding of treatment regimens that are reflective of Canadian clinical practice. In summary, the therapeutic review on multiple myeloma is one demonstration of how CADIF is incorporating real-world evidence in HTA, and there is also potential to explore other disease areas in incorporating real-world evidence. I'll now turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, really great example of how real-world evidence can be used in sort of the post-market drug evaluation setting and put actually into an economic model framework. I think that's a really neat project and a neat area. What I was hoping to speak about is more of the formulary management side, which is sort of a newer area within CADIF. So this is sort of making an intro. I feel like a bit of a debutante at the ball here because not a lot of folks have seen the outputs of this work. But we have a really interesting project in psoriasis that I think could signal some directions for the future of things that could be applied within HTM at CADIF. So formulary management being sort of a new concept, we wanted to sort of create a framework first as far as deciding what aspects were important. So we thought any sort of project related to formulary management should fall within these 4 buckets, pillars, etc. So we thought any sort of work should be related to improving outcomes, whether that's efficacy or safety. There's no reason to do something unless there's a hypothesis that there is an improvement there clinically. There should be predictability. So for patients, physicians, and manufacturers, etc., that any sorts of projects are done in a manner such that no one is caught by surprise. There should be meaningful savings, so meaningful being the key word there, not to save hundreds or thousands of dollars, but perhaps millions or hundreds of millions, such that the effort put forward in the resources to do this kind of work has a good return on that investment. And then finally, we should look towards an improvement of access. And what I mean by that is generally either harmonization of things like listing status or criteria across the country, or modernization, which is bringing listings in line and criteria in line with the most current evidence. So with this framework, we thought, what's some early work, sort of an initial project we can do that sort of fits within these buckets. So if we can go to the next slide. March of this year, as we had developed the framework and started thinking about areas of interest for our payer colleagues, this article was released in the New York Times. It's written by a group out of the Drug Pricing Lab, which is based out of Manhattan. So it's US centric, but they've done a lot of work on biologics in the US market. And they have come forward with a sort of interesting or controversial hypothesis, is that, that biologics are monopolies. And they're monopolies because biosimilars cannot compete adequately. And when you don't have competition, you have a monopoly. And with monopolies, you must regulate. So they've gone forward and proposed regulated price decreases for biologics post loss of exclusivity. It obviously hasn't had uptake in the US yet, but it sort of triggered some questions within the Canadian market where we thought, well, what does this post loss of exclusivity world look like in the Canadian context, given that this was fairly US centric? So if we go to the next slide. We did an environmental scan. Oh, can we click one more? I don't know if I put a build in here by accident. I did. That's a shame. Sorry. If you could click one more, let's build this out. There we go. So what we have here is when we looked at biologics and psoriasis, this is what the life cycle more or less looked like. This is not a specific molecule, but sort of a demonstrative one. And so what we found was, over the period of 8 years, you sort of have your typical uptake of claims and expenditures. And then after the 8-year mark, which is typically the time when data protection expires, you wouldn't have a biosimilar entry. And in fact, it may not have come for 3 to 4 years later. And then after that, of course, the uptake of biosimilars was hindered for various reasons. So I think a lot of the focus that has been paid to biosimilars globally, not just in Canada, has been in that circle, the uptake of biosimilars, but very little attention has been paid into this, let's call it the red area under the curve here, which is the time of which a biosimilar could have entered to when it actually does. And so far we've seen that could be 3-4 years, if not longer. And so that area, as you can see in this demonstrative example, is fairly large. And there's a lot of potential for looking at this as part of formulary management. So with this environmental scan that sort of highlighted some of these timelines, we decided to take sort of a broader look at biologics and psoriasis. So we can go to the next slide. So really, we wanted to take an optimal use sort of 360 view and looking at a few things, not only looking at the sort of old generation, so the pre-2010 biologics, and looking at some of their expenditures, but also looking at some of the new generation ones, because post-2015, there was a lot of new biologics that have come out, and they continue to come out with new mechanisms of action. And a lot of these, actually, most of them have head-to-head evidence versus some of the old generation drugs. And many of the old generation drugs did not undergo PCPA, So their probability of having product listing agreements across the country is much lower than the new generation drugs, which have all gone through PCPA. So there's sort of two aspects to this. There's the red area under the curve, and then from a clinical perspective, what do we do when it comes to new versus old? So based on this project approach, we sort of wanted to ask these 4 questions. And so the ones that are circled, 2 through 4, have the RWE component. The question 1 was based on a network meta-analysis or appraisal of published analyses, which is an RWE, but 2 through 4 are very much looking at utilization analyses. So we'll walk you through a little bit of the approach. If we go to the next slide. This project is still ongoing, but the way that we wanted to craft this so that this is sort of the first foray into formulary management, but not the last, was rather than taking sort of the therapeutic review approach, which requires a lot of time, so a year, but more likely more than a year, and a lot of resources. It's a fairly blunt way of looking at the market because you have to do systematic reviews and economic models, and it becomes a very large task. Whereas with formulary management, we wanted to be much more targeted in our questioning and much more targeted in the analysis we did. So rather than looking at something that was well over a year or multiple years, we thought, let's do this in a matter of months. So we initiated this project in June, and we intend to have it completed before Christmas. That's a commitment we've made. So that is, from start to finish about 6 months. And that includes having done a data collection ask from CIHI using NPDUIS data that we've been able to get within a matter of 2 or 3 months, so very quickly. Also looking at getting some private payer data directly from private payers themselves, which is within conversations at the moment. And then outsourcing a little bit of the analysis with some epidemiologists and validating with clinicians so that we make sure that the analyses are done quickly and correctly. And then sort of CADITH making sure that this is valid from a process perspective, from everything else we've seen in the evidence, and validating and packaging and disseminating the information. So this is sort of the approach we've taken with this project. And so we are sort of entering the end of that analysis phase and moving towards the validation phase. So if we go to the next slide, I think, what the implications are of this kind of work is, especially with this project, is, we sort of have claims data that is generated passively by payers, public and private. And when it sits there, it doesn't necessarily tell us anything. And, we typically think of RWE as requiring registries and efficacy data, but administrative data can tell us a lot about health system performance and can tell us a lot about whether there's optimal use that's going on in the marketplace. So with that, if we can take that data, the raw data, and analyze it, we can turn that into evidence. And that evidence then gives us, use patterns, which payers who are collecting this data passively would not be aware of. So this red area under the curve that we've sort of discovered through some of this work, it's not a criticism of payers to say, look at what you've missed or how come we haven't gone there. It's the fact that this data was sitting there and not being analyzed. And so I think now that we have opportunities to work together with payers through this function, work with different data sets, we can turn that data into evidence and then provide them with what they need for formulary management, or the insights for them to decide what they want to do with that information. And I think that's a great role for CADITH to play in order to help support payers with their sort of decision making. So that's sort of the formulary management overview, and this is the example with psoriasis. And I think now we turn it over to Nicole or Lori for I don't know if we're going to do a few minutes of questions.
I think we're just going to continue, right, Nicole?
Yes, thank you, Lori. I was just going to say, let's just continue on and we'll take questions at the end. I already see a robust number of questions in the question and answer box. Please continue and we'll get to them at the end of the session.
Okay, so I'll go to the next slide. So we're looking to the future now. So one announcement to have about post-marketing drug evaluation is that CADIS has recently been named the new host of the Drug Safety and Effectiveness Network. This was decided in August, and right now Health Canada, CIHR, and CADIS are working together to organize the transition to CADIS, and CADIS already has a new transition team in place to make that happen. Next slide. We won't go into detail here, but already thinking about some guiding principles. I think, you know, a lot of these themes we've talked about from our previous speakers, you know, of having to, we need to be flexible, we need to be responsive to all stakeholders. CADIS continues to need to be accountable and to collaborate and coordinate with all the stakeholders, and we need to optimize the evidence to make sure that it's fit for purpose and that it's meeting decision makers' needs. Next slide. Some of the new model elements that are being considered right now is what is the funding mechanism. So the thinking now is that there will be grants and contracts, accountability and priority setting. So, you know, we need dedicated leadership within the host organization to really monitor what's going on. We need participation and collaboration from multi-stakeholders, decision makers, researchers, patients, and we need the scientific capacity to assess, is this feasible and is this going to answer the needs of the decision makers? The process for the queries or the projects, you know, to be guided by research priorities, thinking about, you know, balancing out between short-term and long-term, being proactive versus reactive, and looking at both safety and effectiveness, and looking at queries that are going to leverage real-world evidence, you know, that are going to support both regulatory and formulary listing decisions. Next slide. Other things thinking about, lots to think about, you know, but knowledge mobilization and dissemination. So when there is investment in collecting this real world evidence, how do we make sure we meet the decision makers' needs, but do we make it broadly accessible to more people to learn from it? What's going to be the mechanism for the query or response? And capacity, right? How are we going to develop the capacity to leverage what CIHR had, their health research training platform program? So, you know, this could be another whole session, but we just wanted to put it out there to make sure people know about this. Next slide. So the CADIS RWE program. So as Nicole said, I'm the lead of real world evidence, and we sort of had our first big event that's going to help inform us how to move forward. We were involved in a best brains exchange, which was a collaboration between CIHR, CADIS, CORD, and Health Canada. And we also worked with the RWE for Decisions International Initiative. We had 150 different stakeholders over 2 days. We had representatives of 13 different types of stakeholders from all across Canada. And all these people were broken up into breakout rooms. And we just started talking about how do we do this? How do we optimize the integration of real world evidence? In this case, sorry, I put DRD with our abbreviations up for drugs for rare disease. Next slide. So just to show you, we had a very balanced distribution of stakeholder groups. So we had rare disease registry holders, we had private payers, we had public payers, we had patient organizations, we had medical administrative data holders, industry was there, CADIS and INES, Health Canada, CIHR, we had some academics and methodologists, and we had academic rare disease care providers. So really trying to get all those different perspectives. Next slide. So we basically created in this event, we created a multi-stakeholder scientific advice team. So we had 5 teams that stayed together over the 2 days, and they discussed. So we had a case scenario, and so we had to come to a consensus. What are the most important problems? What are the most important uncertainties and gaps in the evidence? What are the questions we need to answer? What are the outcomes that we need to measure? How are we going to do that? And how are we going to work together to make that happen? Next slide. So some of the highlights that we got back to, we just got this from CIHR. They have a little survey, but we're doing more work. But just as a first off, people really like the diversity of stakeholders that were around the table. They liked that the event, we're looking, as I said at the beginning of this session, we're looking for solutions. We don't want to talk any more about the problems unless it's in order to find solutions. We need to learn from each other, and I'm certainly learning from all my colleagues that spoke today. And we need to consider all the stakeholders because, as this person said, it's very complex. It was more complex than they realized, but these challenges are not insurmountable. Next slide. So the most important, 41%, the reason what people were there for was everyone wants to move forward. So I think that's fair, and I certainly agree, and that's why I'm here. And many of the respondents, made a plea to reach out, and we're reaching out to you today, to different stakeholders to follow up on how do we move this forward. Next slide. Some of the proposed comments, but we're talking and we're listening together, but we need to involve CADIF and the HTA process very early so that we have time to make sure that if we want to create RWE, we're meeting all the needs. Early, what we've talked about all session yesterday and today, how do we remove these barriers to data linkages? We need to come up with some concrete examples where RWE was valuable. Peter's just given an example. So let's find out what was valuable, why was it valuable, how do we do it again? We need to create a multi-stakeholder learning network to learn from each other. We have to involve the patients all the way along. And we need to learn by doing, right? We need to learn how to collaborate and how to do this work together. Next slide. So what are we going to do? So we're from the BBE, we've identified some really good Canadian stories about the value of real world evidence. So we're going to write those up and study them, and we're going to show what does success look like. And then we're going to share those stories, and we're going to request other people, do you have a story that we can learn from? And we will also publish a report on this event that will be public and share that with people as well. Next slide. We're also working at a pan-Canadian level, so we're actively talking, meeting regularly now with Health Canada, with INESS, with CIHI, with Statistics Canada, with Health Data Research Network, with CORD, with industry, IMC Biotech. And we want to find some learning projects with each of these pan-Canadian health organizations to try and move forward. Next slide. We're also involved in an RWE learning group with INATA. So on an international level now we're talking. Next slide. Here it comes. We're officially a member of the RWE for Decisions initiative, which is an international, it's European, but more and more we realize we have a lot of similarities, the same challenges as the European situation. So we're heavily involved with RWE for Decisions now. Next slide. Just to say their vision, that we stakeholders agree what data can be collected for highly innovative technologies, when, by whom, and how. I think we're very much in alignment with this already. Next slide. Also, we're involved with ISPE that has an RWE task force to develop a critical appraisal guidance for HTA. So what's appropriate, what's adequate, what's fit for purpose, what are the potential bias domains, and looking at sensitivity analysis with different assumptions, an analysis of bias. So how can we be reproducible? How can we repeat findings? You know we need to trust this data. If we're going to use real world evidence, people trust RCT data. We need to have RWE that we want to use, as Nicole often says, decision grade. So we have to trust it. Next slide. And there's me, proof that I am on the a panel with the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences. So I'm helping to co-write a manual. I won't go into it now about RWE. Next slide. And then we're also trying to work, I'm involved with Institute of Health Economics. They've got workshops going on. We're working with Can Revalue. We're working with the Alberta RWE Consortium, O2, CFIN, Core Health. You know, just to mention, RWE is also for devices. That's the world where I come from and know best. So the drug side of things is new to me. So, you know, we're also working at that level. Next slide. And we've created an RWE steering committee with these pan-Canadian organizations around the table. We're going to meet on a regular basis. And then the blue dots, the other people on the committee on this session have much better slides than me. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to work on that. But these blue dots are just gonna be individuals, other organizations that will add in to try and start talking, to start doing. Next slide. So all this is to say is we are launching, this is our learning period for real world evidence at CADIT. I think you can see there's a lot going on. We were already doing some things. So I'm working with all the people that presented today. How can we get better? How can we learn? We're working with our partners outside of CADIT as well. But we're saying we're learning how to do this. So we need everyone to be with that same vision. Next slide. So we're just thinking about, you know, Amy sort of pointed out, but when you know, ideally we're going to use real world evidence from very early on, but we don't want to start only at the beginning. So we, you know, would like to do some learning projects and learn about how can RWE be integrated at many different points through the life. So the early scientific advice has, as Amy mentioned, but after a pivotal trial, but before HTA submission. So what, you know, what are the gaps? Where are they? Can RWE fill these gaps? In reimbursement reviews, during deliberation, and even thinking about the development of recommendations, thinking about RWE. Once we have a recommendation, you know, what real world evidence needs to be generated to fill important gaps that are there. So we know other people are doing outcomes-based managed entry agreements. So can we provide advice on how to do that? And then once it is post-market, a bit like, you know, Peter has presented, we're going to be looking at drug safety and effectiveness, and we're also looking at optimal use. So huge opportunity, I think, is the message, and that we're open to learning and listening. Next slide. Questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Lori, and to all of the presenters. Now, the trick for me will be to stop sharing. I hope so. And okay, so that looks like we've done that. And really, thanks for giving us those presentations, and really a little bit about the new and not so new work on RWE that we've been doing here at CADIT. Really just trying to ensure that we have an open and transparent dialogue. So I see lots of questions and a robust question and answer session here. So why don't I jump right in? I think that some of them have been, oh, can you see that still?
We see you right now.
Me. All right, I've lost you though, but let's just see if I can get back. All right, I'm back. All right, well, so that's good. So just a couple of questions. I think, there are a number of questions for each of you. And I thought maybe Peter, there's a question there in the questions about the patient perspective. As you evolve your projects, for your projects and processes for the future and future in different therapeutic areas, have you considered giving other stakeholders, example patients, more of a voice in the assessments?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say when we have started the psoriasis project, it's broken into several different modules. There was an environmental scan and a utilization component. Both of those went, the scoping of them both went open for stakeholder feedback, and we actually did get very robust feedback from several patient groups who did provide their perspective on both those projects. And we certainly took their comments and actually incorporated those into the study design as we did them. So we're actually hoping to get the patient perspective into the work, but not after we're done to get their feedback, but actually early on in the scoping phase to make sure that we're capturing what they value. So great question, and certainly something that's very top of mind as this evolves.
Thanks, Peter, and certainly an opportunity to work with our patient engagement team, right, for understanding and engaging with the patient community. Another question I have for Mandy. Why are you not running a systematic review on RWE at initial submission to CADTH instead of looking for gaps?
Tough one, Mandy.
Thank you. I bought some time by trying to find my unmute button. No, but it's a really great question. And this is something I think that we struggle with, when we're developing the protocols for all of our reviews, and where do we limit it? And I guess the truth of the matter really is that we try to evaluate the information that can provide the most value, right? And the strength of the evidence associated with the clinical trials tends to carry more weight. At this point, we're using the real world evidence to fill those gaps, and more is supportive evidence. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's more of a feasibility thing at this point.
Thanks very much, Mandy. Amanda, I have a question for you. You highlighted that you'll be working with a Netherlands group, and then there's also some discussion about Canadian data. Can you describe some of the sources that you'll be using to help support your multiple myeloma analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for that question. So currently, we are exploring potential Canadian database holders to supplement the real-world data for our inclusion in the real-world evidence. But as far as the Netherlands' involvement in our therapeutic review, they have been leaders as far as already conducting network meta-analyses in 2 patient populations, the transplant ineligible and the relapse refractory. And what's really neat is that their economic model was leading in that it incorporated Dutch registry data, but we'd like to replicate this only using instead Canadian relevant data. But at this time, we're still in discussions with exploring who could possibly provide us with the Canadian data set.
Thanks, Amanda. I have a question for Lori. Lori, is there information available on the methods for conducting RWE that CADTH would find acceptable? For example, some valid database or standards.
So the hard part for me right now is that there are so many standards. So there's standards being created all over the world. And so we need to work out. And if I'm honest, Nicole will remember that even when I got interviewed, I said, if you want me to write a policy document on standards, then, then that's not what I want to do, but it's out there. So what I think, this is just me personally, and I'm showing my bias right away, is we know that it's out there. We see what's being used. People are already bringing it together, like ISPI's already doing systematic reviews of all the guidance that's out there. So I think we have to just know about it, read it, and decide what works best for us. But I keep arguing, maybe I'm wrong, but saying, I think we know what good evidence is. And I'm now hearing, which is making me feel better, we're never going to have one document that says this is how to do this, right? This is complex and every case is going to be different. So we have to have all those basic principles, but we have to come to a consensus on what we agree is appropriate and not appropriate and work it out together. That's what I honestly believe.
So, and maybe I can just add another couple of thoughts. I mean, certainly there are, international guidelines and guidelines on how to conduct a good observational study. Those have been around for a long period of time, but it's not only about the study designs, but it's about the veracity of the data, the quality of the data. And so we're trying to marry not only some of the methodology with actually things that you take for granted in a clinical trial space, where you assume that things are audited. You assume that there's a clear protocol, that people have consented to their data, who has access to the data. For anyone who's ever filled out an REB form, those are all the kinds of questions that we assume will happen in an RCT, and we take that for granted. And we're not necessarily always sure that happens in either a registry and or an observational data set. So there are layers and tiers around that. So we're wrapping our mind around some of those particular issues that are required then for submission. So ultimately, I would imagine that this, we've published guidelines on economic analysis, guidelines on systematic reviews. This will ultimately lead to some sort of document that will talk about speak about the quality of the data sets. One thing that I can answer very quickly, one question was, are payers represented at the RWE steering committee? And yes, they are. We have not only PCPA, but we have a number of payers from provinces across the country. And along with sort of a pan-Canadian approach of data holders and Stats Canada, for example, CI-High, and data users as well. We also have patient members on the RWE steering committee, as well as individuals who are academics and methodologists to help provide advice on methods. All right, so let's see, we have a number of other questions. They're coming fast and furious. We have, I'm trying to keep up. Let's say for Peter, can you share some of the outcomes you were looking for with the psoriasis project?
Yeah, certainly. So the questions we were asking were really identifying utilization patterns. So we wanted to understand what the utilization of old versus new generation drugs were for both new patients and existing, because the hypothesis is that despite a lot of the new generation drugs having head-to-head superiority evidence, that physicians were still prescribing a lot of old generation drugs for new patients. So that was a big one. Also looking at sort of average costs per patient per year as well for existing and new patients. And that obviously is based on list prices, not net, but still gives some interesting insight into which biologics have typically higher dosing than might be expected. And then we also looked at utilization and expenditure after loss of exclusivity for some of the old generation drugs. So that's sort of an interesting marker that we're looking at in terms of kind of adding up the opportunity cost of what payers have paid after a biosimilar could have been on the market. So that's sort of a newer approach, but those are sort of the main outcomes that you'll see in the utilization publication that will come out, as I mentioned, by Christmas. Thanks
very much, Peter. Amy, I have a question for you now. You mentioned about the out of the submissions that you received through the scientific advice program, that half of the questions were related to RWE, or at least 50% of the questions had some RWE questions. Can you describe or dig a little deeper for us about what those RWE questions consisted of?
Thanks, Nicole. So just to clarify, what I had meant was that 14 out of 28 projects had an RWE question. So not to say that the projects entirely consisted of RWE questions, but I could elaborate a little further. I had mentioned that some of the questions involved real-world data to inform indirect comparisons, and certainly questions also revolved around potential external control arms, particularly for single-arm trials. We also had questions related to whether a surrogate outcome, as I had mentioned, could be further validated with real-world evidence, showing correlations with longer-term clinical outcomes. And we've also considered questions around natural history of disease, as well as which potential databases and registries would be available in Canada. And so I would say about half of the questions that we get are quite specific, and then the other half are quite broad in terms of asking about additional types of studies and real-world evidence that could support the clinical development program. And so I'll end it there. Hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thanks for the clarification. That was my fault, not the question's fault. Apologies for the interpretation. A couple of or a question for Lori. What has been the role of industry or pharma collaboration in helping shape the RWE plan for or the RWE Pan-Canadian initiative?
Well, I've been working a lot. IMC Biotech had 2 representatives on the RWE steering committee, and I've really worked very closely with them, but of talking to them, I'm able to call them up, ask questions, listen and learn again. We've also had some meetings with them, presenting ideas, getting feedback from them, but also, Nicole and I have met with a number of groups over the last year. We really have done a lot of talking and listening and sharing ideas, often after hours, right? But just talking to people to understand their point of view. So some of it's been on a more formal basis. We've met with Rare Eye as well. And some of it's been on a more informal basis. And I've been on lots of different panels too, with conferences like this as well. So where you're talking together. So in lots of different ways, for sure, that we are involving them and listening.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think, even just going back to sort of first principles, what do we mean by real world evidence, right? We often talk about non-clinical trial data, which means it could be anything from utilization studies, which we saw an example of today. It could mean looking at patient-reported outcomes. It could mean looking at utility values that go into an economic evaluation. It could also mean looking at outcomes and safety beyond the clinical trial paradigm. And I think that's where we're just trying to understand, where are the needs? And some of the work, as you've seen, actually, we've already been moving in that direction. Mandy, I have a question for you about potential sort of coverage with evidence development process at the beginning in your presentation. Can you comment again how that is evolving, and are jurisdictions engaged from a process and infrastructure point of view? And maybe that's a combination between Mandy and Lori.
Yeah, so I can start things off. So we don't have much more that I can share at the moment, other than what we've already presented in the slides. We're sort of just starting the discussions to see exactly how everybody will be involved and I guess, what the potential challenges are. We have already sort of, there's a few key questions that we need to resolve before we can move this thing forward. For example, who ultimately is going to pay pay for, who is going to collect, analyze, evaluate the new evidence, who is going to pay for the drug while this new evidence is being generated, and so on and so forth. Those are just a couple of things that we're still trying to figure out at this time.
I guess the only thing I would add was that something, you know, those are the questions, but I think the important point is that we are talking about it now with all the stakeholders. As I said, we have a lot of ideas that came out of the Best Brains Exchange, and we'll share that report. And again, we're going to have to, right? When I started back with my career of doing this in 2004, it's again, you just have to start doing it, right? And everyone just needs to understand, as I said, it's a learning period, but the only way we'll learn how to do this is if we try it and find examples of where it was successful. And so we know what success looks like, as Nicole often says. We need to know what success looks like, and then we need to try and do it and learn from our mistakes. But hopefully there won't be many.
Well, I mean, thank you all. And it sounds like, I mean, there's certainly, there are a number of other discussions or questions in the chat function. I don't think we'll be able to get to them all. I'll maybe have one more out there about the quality of the RWE data is so important for the validity of evidence generated at any stage of the life cycle approach. And, you know, so there are different groups that actually have already done very, you know, have improved the quality of the data or have standards around there. And is that something that we can use? So it's just something to think about, for example, with CIHI or Stats Canada, leveraging their data, and how do the other provincial databases leverage into their data sets or then have their own quality metrics and controls. So lots of things for us to think about, along with what are the kinds of elements we're looking for as you're reviewing, as we're thinking about reviewing data. So maybe in the last 3 minutes, maybe if I just go around well, I was going to say the circle, but the squares, and if there are any sort of final thoughts on RWE amongst the group. So maybe I can start with Amanda.
Oh, that's a great question, Nicole. I would say, in fact, a slide in the presentation earlier really tried to illustrate what value real-world evidence plays, particularly in the oncology space. I just wanted to highlight, we're able to have longer-term follow-up data, which means we can also assess potential benefits around overall survival. And oftentimes in trials, we see, you know, that overall survival data is immature. And similarly, real-world data really provides insights into treatment regimens used more so in the Canadian context. And oftentimes in trials, we're dealing with international populations and trials that are outside the scope of standard of care. So in summary, I think real-world data has tremendous value as far as in the oncology and possibly even other disease areas as well.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Amy.
Thanks, Nicole. I would just reiterate what I had mentioned before about encouraging applicants to the CADIS Scientific Advice Program to really start thinking early and incorporating some real-world evidence planning into the briefing book submission package, because it's never too early to start thinking about it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Amy. Peter.
Yeah, I think you touched on your last point there, Nicole, in terms of quality of data. I think I'll build off that to say, you know, the quality of the data will only be as good as what everyone puts into it. And so there is an opportunity for broader sharing of data, especially when we start looking at, you know, administrative data. Sometimes we can get a good data set from CIHI, but it could be missing elements that could be housed with other organizations, you know, data houses or industry or what have you. I think being able to share those things to provide the most robust data set so that we can provide the most accurate analysis and insights would be beneficial to all. And so I'd really say, you know, as we move forward with this, continuing the dialogue and increasing our collaboration will be key to improve quality.
Thanks very much, Peter. And Peter knows I'm a data nerd, so that's music to my ears. Mandy.
So I see we just have 1 minute left, so I'm going to be super quick to give Laurie a chance. But I just want to reiterate as well, don't be shy. If you have real world evidence that you think can fill some of the evidence gaps in your submission, please do include it. The team will look at it, and if it's appropriate, we will summarize and critically appraise it to fill those gaps and give the decision makers, you know, the best information that we can.
Thanks, Mandy. Laurie?
So I'll be very quick and repeat what I said at my last session earlier today. So it's just do it and do it now.
And I think with that, since as the moderator, I might actually have the last word, which is fantastic for me. You know, really, we're very open, as Mandy indicated, and other folks, of looking at different ways to use real world data in the life cycle approach to any of the products that we review here at CADIF. And so please get in touch with us. And we are launching our learning period starting now. Thank you. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Nicole. Bye, everyone.
Okay. I don't know if we're off. No.